So for this week's devotion, I wanted to start by sharing part of Paul's letter to the Philippians. And keep in mind, as Paul's writing this, he's writing from prison, and yet we still get words like this. So let's listen for what Paul writes to his friends in Philippi from a jail cell. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. The Lord is near. Do not worry about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let it be made known to God. And the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will guide your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Now let me share something. I thought that if I ever to ever take up a life as a masked vigilante, my shtick would be hiding out at funeral homes, and I would come out and kick people in the shins anytime they would say anything that attempted to diminish or deny the pain and grief that families were experiencing. It's just my thing. That would be the great vigilante crusade that I would take up as a masked avenger. There's just something for me that really hits me about telling people what they should be feeling. And it may be well-intentioned, and people might be trying to do the right thing, but it's always struck me as rather manipulative. So, of course, when I read Paul's ode to joy here in Philippians, maybe I'm the only guy, or maybe you think of this too, who's thinking, hey, Paul, don't tell people going through difficult times or who are grieving how they're supposed to feel. But kind of, if you read the whole letter, if you know what Paul's going through, and even just in this one little section, we see that Paul's not trying to strong-arm people into feeling a certain way. Rather, Paul's trying to let his readers know that joy is possible. And he points that way forward to joy as a way of life, and joy not just as an incidental feeling, as a reaction to stimulus, but perhaps joy also as a way of life that we can begin to practice and develop before those difficult times come. Because again, Paul is writing this letter from prison. So he's not naive, nor is he in denial. He's not in denial of what's going on in his own life. He's aware of a world that is broken and in need of help. It's part of the story that he tells in other letters, and it's part of his own experience. He knows that there is something deeply broken and corrupt in this world. But at the core of life is the promise that this is God's good creation, and that Jesus has come and has been raised from the dead, and that there are things that have corrupted and disfigured the goodness of creation. But the fundamental nature of life and the world is that it is a good gift. A gift we have received, and a gift we are invited to share. And in acknowledging and receiving a gift, the natural response is gratitude and joy. And it is also knowing that this is a gift of God. Another response is faith, knowing that God is ultimately the one who is the giver of all good things and the one who will meet us where we are. Now, in order to be able to see that goodness is a practice. It is an exercise. It is a discipline. Human perception and mentalities are incredibly malleable things, shaped by habits and environments. And whether it's human nature or a particular culture, we can tend to see the deficits and the negatives around us and can begin to be ground down into a state of cynical resignation. We can begin to say things like, well, that's just the way things are. That's just the nature of things. We are in need of disciplines that help us to see the gifts and grace of life, not to become Pollyannish, not to deny that there are problems and pain and death and tragedy and injustice in this world. They are real and to be reckoned with. But rather what we need is to acknowledge that we live in a cynical age, and that if we do not adjust our vision, that we can miss the beauty and goodness of this world that is needed to sustain us through the sin and corruption and death of this world, through lives committed to peace, justice, and reconciliation. We need to know, as Paul wrote at the beginning of this letter, that God has begun a good thing among us and will bring it to completion, and we need eyes to see it. And so as we read Paul's invitation to rejoice, this should not be picked up as a cudgel to beat people up for feeling grief during a time of tragedy. It should certainly not be used to shame people for experiencing outrage in the wake of injustice and violence. There are things that should make us weep. There are things that should awaken within us a passion and even an anger for justice and righteousness. Instead, rejoice is an invitation to develop habits and practices that put us in touch with the core, fundamental goodness of the world that God created and called good. It helps us to see the signs of the God who has indeed begun that good work among us and is indeed bringing it to completion. There are bad and painful things in this world, but we will succumb to despair and simply accept the worst if we do not have eyes to see God's beauty, healing, and love woven all throughout life and creation itself. Rejoice! Not because everything is hunky-dory, not because we're just going to look on the bright side of things, but rejoice because in our work to bring healing, where we see injury, and justice, where we have chosen to see inequity, we need a vision of God's good world being restored to its original goodness, to push us through the difficult times, to push us through the good fight. And that's made possible through the one who experienced our worst upon the cross and overcame it in his resurrection, Jesus Christ. Rejoice, because it is the forces of sin and darkness that wish for us to accept the worst as the way things are. It is the forces of sin and darkness that wish for us to succumb to the despair and to the rage and the violence that are around us, and wish for us to deny that joy and hope are possible. It is in those moments that rejoicing may indeed be not a denial of injustice or a denial of what is wrong in this world, but that rejoice may itself be an act of resistance. So what can we do to develop a spirit and practice of gratitude and joy? It can be as simple as finding 5 minutes to write down, reflect upon, or discuss the things for which you are thankful for every day. Anything that allows us to move from a mentality of deficit to a mentality of plenty, to know that all we need to fulfill our mission as God's people is here, and we may rejoice. And whatever practice allows you to see the goodness and gifts of life and creation around you, if you can see the things for which you are grateful for, perhaps in retrospect you will begin to see them in the present moment more and more clearly. Let us go forward confident that the God who began a good work among us will bring it to completion. And let us give thanks and rejoice. Amen.